My name is Dulce Whitford. I'm 28 years old, and for most of my life my parents labeled me as the slow one, while my sister Miranda was praised for her Ivy League success and promises of a large inheritance. For years they joked about my dyslexia at family dinners, left me out of important discussions and treated me like I mattered less in every way, even financially. But everything changed on the day of Miranda's graduation at the Plaza Hotel. In front of 350 guests, a stranger placed an envelope in my hands, one that would uncover the truth my parents had hidden for decades. What they didn't realize was that my grandmother had quietly seen it all. She knew how I was treated, and before she passed she made a decision that would turn the entire Whitford legacy upside down. The Whitfords were considered old money in Manhattan, the kind of family whose name was engraved on hospital wings and museum walls. My father, Gerald Whitford, ran Whitford Properties, a commercial real estate company my grandmother, Ella Lehner, had started in 1965 from a small Brooklyn office. By 2024, it had grown into a $92 million business. I was diagnosed with dyslexia at 7, and reading was always a struggle because the words seemed to shift and blur, making simple tasks feel overwhelming. Instead of offering support, my parents reacted with disappointment. When I was 12, they invested heavily in Miranda's future. Private violin lessons at Juilliard, French immersion programs, and SAT tutoring from a Princeton graduate who charged $400 an hour. When I asked for extra help with reading, my mother, Priscilla, brushed it off and said they had already spent enough on specialists and that maybe academics just weren't my strength. I believed her at the time, and that belief stayed with me for years. So I found my own way to cope. Audiobooks became my daily companion, and I created color-coded notes, diagrams, and flowcharts to understand information in a way that worked for me. Every Sunday, I took the train to my grandmother Ella Lehner's apartment on the Upper West Side, where she patiently explained lessons through stories instead of textbooks. She once held my hand and told me that while I read more slowly, I noticed details others overlooked, and that was a strength, not a weakness. I didn't fully grasp her words back then, but they stayed with me. Over time, I realized she saw something in me that no one else did. Still, I had to endure years of feeling like the family's quiet disappointment. At Christmas in 2018, about 20 relatives gathered in my parents' Upper East Side townhouse under sparkling chandeliers for what felt like another staged display of family perfection. My father stood at the head of the long mahogany table and proudly announced that Miranda had been accepted to Harvard Law School on a full scholarship. The room filled with applause and praise, and he proudly declared she would take the family name to new heights. Relatives congratulated her warmly, some even tearing up. Then my father glanced toward me and casually added, "And Dulce is here too." The energy shifted and a few uneasy laughs echoed around the table. In that moment I felt small, invisible, and underestimated, but that would not last forever. Miranda didn't stand up for me that night. She laughed with everyone else while I kept my eyes on my plate, trying not to show how much it hurt. The food in front of me went out of focus as I fought back tears. Then I felt a gentle squeeze under the table, Grandma Eleanor's thin hand holding mine. When I looked at her, her expression was calm, but her eyes burned with quiet anger, aimed straight at her own son. She didn't say a word, but her silence spoke volumes. 3 months later, she called me to her apartment and said she had something important to share. I didn't realize it then, but that holiday dinner had started a chain of events that would take 5 years to fully unfold. After graduating from a state university in 2022, never an Ivy League school despite the family pressure, I applied for a job at Whitford Properties. I wanted to show I could add value and earn my place. My father hired me as an administrative assistant with a $42,000 salary, while that same month Miranda stepped in as chief legal counsel earning $280,000 plus bonuses. My days were filled with copying paperwork, scheduling rooms, and bringing coffee to executives who barely knew who I was. I wasn't included in meetings or trusted with real responsibilities, but I paid attention. During those long hours, I noticed I had a talent for recognizing patterns others overlooked. When I overheard conversations about deals, I drew diagrams mapping out connections, money flow, and possible risks. The strategy one once used to manage my dyslexia had grown into a real strength. Grandma Eleanor had encouraged that way of thinking. On Sundays at her apartment, she would lay out old company contracts and teach me to understand them as systems instead of just lines of text. In 2019, before her health declined, she told me my father read contracts only to find personal advantage, but I studied them like someone building a structure, seeing how every piece fit together. That same day, she handed me a small mahogany box with brass hinges and told me to keep it safe and open it only when the time felt right. I took it home, unsure what she meant, but I never forgot her tone. In March 2019, sitting across from her in the living room filled with decades of framed achievements, photos of her breaking ground on her first Brooklyn property in 1965, shaking hands with the mayor and receiving business awards, I noticed something missing. There were no pictures of my father leading the company. At 82, she looked frail, but her voice still carried strength as she reminded me that she built Whitford Properties from a single office through 60 years of hard work. My father, she said plainly, didn't build it, he simply inherited it. He didn't build it, Grandma said firmly. He doesn't understand what it takes to create something from the ground up. I tried to defend my father, saying he values degrees, titles, and strong performances in boardrooms, but she shook her head. She told me she measures people by how they treat those who can't defend themselves, and in her eyes, I was the only one in the family who truly showed kindness. Then she placed the small wooden box back into my hands and said there was something inside that could help me one day, but I wasn't ready yet, and neither was my father. Her voice grew serious as she added that when the right moment came, when he clearly revealed who he really was, I would understand what to do. I had so many questions about what she meant and why she chose me, but she smoothly changed the topic, talking about simple things like her garden and the book she was reading. 18 months later, she passed away from pancreatic cancer, and I was the only family member sitting beside her in hospice, holding her hand until the end. The box stayed unopened in my closet, heavy with meaning. In April 2024, I received an email at work with the subject line, "Position Restructuring, Confidential." It informed me that my role would be eliminated by July 1st and that HR would discuss severance. I read it over and over, hoping I misunderstood, but the message was clear: they were letting me go. That evening, while finishing tasks that suddenly felt pointless, I overheard my parents talking through the thin office wall. My father said it wouldn't look right once Miranda became CEO if his sister was still working as an assistanting. He worried people would question why I wasn't in leadership or ask uncomfortable things about me. My mother softly replied that they had done all they could and that maybe I simply wasn't suited for more. My father agreed and said I should move on to something that matched my abilities. Hearing that hurt more than the job loss itself. With my $42,000 salary and rent in Queens at $1,800 a month shared with 2 roommates, I had no cushion to fall back on. But what truly weighed on me was the thought that if I accepted their view of me, I would carry that label forever. Not because I had failed, but because I had never been given a fair chance. The next evening was Miranda's graduation celebration at the Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom. More than 350 guests filled the elegant room. Business partners, investors, attorneys, and distant relatives. Crystal chandeliers reflected light across the tables while a live orchestra played softly in the corner. It was my father's stage, where he presented himself as the successful leader of a powerful family. I stood near the entrance in a simple black dress I could barely afford, adjusting the fabric and reminding myself that this night might change everything. Everyone else sparkled in designer gowns and perfectly fitted tuxedos. Before I could even sit down, my mother stopped me. Her eyes scanned me from my simple makeup to my worn heels, and her expression tightened. She asked if I couldn't find something better to wear. I told her this was the best I had. She adjusted her Cartier bracelet and informed me I'd be seated at table 27 near the service entrance and reminded me not to draw attention to myself. Then she leaned in, her strong perfume filling the air, and warned me that this was Miranda's night. Whatever I felt, she said, I should keep it hidden and not embarrass the family. She walked away without waiting for a reply. Table 27 was tucked behind a pillar at the back of the ballroom, almost out of sight. I sat with distant cousins I barely knew. From there I could see the stage, a huge portrait of Miranda in her Harvard robes, and a banner congratulating her on graduating from Harvard Law in 2024. Near the entrance stood a silver-haired man in a gray suit. He wasn't talking to anyone, just watching the room, and at one point his eyes locked onto mine. A strange chill ran through me. At 8:30 p.m. the orchestra stopped and the lights dimmed as a spotlight focused on my father holding a glass of champagne. He thanked everyone for coming to celebrate an exceptional young woman, and applause filled the room before he even finished speaking. He proudly listed Miranda's achievements, graduating in the top 5% of her class, completing a clerkship with Justice Reynolds, and quickly earning a partner-track position at Sullivan and Cromwell. Then he announced her future. Miranda joined him on stage in a stunning emerald Valentino gown as he declared she would inherit his entire estate, including the family's Park Avenue residence valued at $13 million, a Tesla Model S Plaid, and eventually the role of CEO at Whitford Properties. The crowd rose to its feet, cheering and flashing cameras, while Miranda smiled and pretended to wipe away tears. Not one person looked toward table 27. A cousin beside me quietly asked what this meant for me. I had no answer. How could I explain that I had just been erased from the family story, that I was losing my job, and that every doubt I had ever carried was being confirmed in front of hundreds of people? As the applause faded and Miranda hugged our father, I noticed the silver-haired man walking toward me with steady steps, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. He stopped at my table. Up close, he looked to be in his early 60s, with sharp eyes and the calm posture of someone used to courtrooms. He addressed me as Miss Whitford and I straightened in my chair. When I asked if I could help him, he introduced himself as Jonathan Ellis and handed me his business card. The business card read in raised cream lettering, "Morrison and Blake, Attorneys at Law." Jonathan Ellis calmly explained that he had been my grandmother Eleanor's lawyer. Hearing her name felt like a sudden to the chest. I told him she had passed away 3 years ago and he nodded, saying he was aware. Without sitting down or lowering his steady tone, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick cream envelope sealed with red wax and a notary stamp. He said it was her will, the real one, and that my father had no idea it existed. I froze, staring at the seal dated September 12, 2019, just 5 months after the day Grandma had given me the wooden box. Alice explained that she had given strict instructions. The document was to be delivered only on the day my father publicly removed me from his future plans. He glanced toward the stage where the applause was still echoing and quietly said that moment had just happened. My hands shook as I took the envelope and asked what it contained. He repeated my grandmother's words, that I would be ready when the time came, and then he stepped away into the crowd. I couldn't stay in that ballroom another second. I slipped out through the service hallway near the kitchen, where the bright overhead lights hummed and the party noise faded into the background. Breaking the wax seal, I unfolded 3 pages of formal legal writing, signed and notarized. Slowly, carefully, I read each line despite the words trying to blur together. The document clearly revoked all prior versions and declared itself her final will. Then I saw it. She had left me 51% of her shares in Whitford Properties, worth around $47 million, along with full voting control. I reread the sentence again and again to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The will stated plainly that I had been overlooked not because I lacked ability, but because I lacked support, and that she would not allow that unfair treatment to continue after her passing. Tears filled my eyes because she had understood everything. But there was one condition. I had 72 hours to request an emergency board meeting, or the will would become void and everything would transfer according to her older 2015 plan. The deadline was May 18 at 8:30 p.m. I leaned against the cold wall, holding the papers tightly. My grandmother had handed me control of the company, if I was brave enough to claim it. When I walked back out, Jonathan Ellis was waiting near the coat check. He asked if I had read the clause about the 72 hours and I nodded, my voice shaking as I asked why she would set such a strict deadline. "Your grandmother knew you well, Miss Whitford," Alice said quietly, handing me another card with his personal number written on the back. He explained that she understood I might hesitate if I had too much time, so the 72-hour deadline wasn't meant to pressure me, it was meant to push me forward. It was her way of giving me permission to stop waiting for approval and finally claim what was mine. He reminded me the cutoff was May 18 at 8:30 p.m., and if I chose to move ahead, we needed to file a formal request for an emergency board meeting right away. Through the ballroom doors, I could still see my father smiling for photos beside Miranda while my mother accepted praise from guests. I knew that if I acted, it would shatter whatever fragile connection I still had with them. They would see it as betrayal. But if I stayed silent, I would be agreeing with everything they believed about me. Alice interrupted my racing thoughts and said my grandmother had spent years preparing for this moment because she believed in me. The real question, he said, was whether I believed in myself. I looked down at her signature on the will and felt something shift inside me. I told him I would call the next day and that we would request the meeting. He gave a small nod, almost as if he had expected that answer. Later that night, back in my small apartment in Queens, I finally opened the wooden box she had given me years ago. My roommates were asleep, and the only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across my bed. The hinges creaked softly as I lifted the lid. Inside was a handwritten letter on her personal stationery, an old document stamped 1965, and a USB drive that had clearly been added later. I read the letter first. She wrote that if I was holding it, then events had unfolded exactly as she feared. She apologized for not being able to shield me while she was alive but promised she could still protect me now. The old document, she explained, was the original 1965 partnership agreement from when she founded Whitford Properties with two colleagues. It stated that the founder's shares carried permanent voting rights that could not be reduced or transferred without full board approval. She also revealed that in 2018 my father had tried to cut her voting power from 51% to 10%, claiming she was too old to understand business. The board rejected his proposal and she never forgot that attempt. She wrote that his treatment of me had been part of his effort to weaken her influence. She urged me to use this information carefully, not for revenge but for fairness. My hands were steady now as I plugged the USB drive into my laptop, knowing the next step could change everything. The file on the USB was labeled Board Meeting Minutes, March 2018. It was a PDF showing clear time-stamped proof that my father had tried to take control away from his own mother. Early the next morning, May 16 at 9:01 a.m., I called Margaret Coleman. She answered on the second ring, her voice rough but confident, and said she had been expecting my call. She told me she and my grandmother had worked together for decades and that Grandma had spoken about me often. She also admitted she had known about the updated will for 3 years. When I said I was planning to request an emergency board meeting, Margaret explained that it required signatures from 3 board members. She was willing to sign and she believed at least 2 others would as well. She mentioned Richard Holloway and Susan Parker, both of whom had quietly grown tired of my father's controlling leadership style. She warned me that this would not be easy, that my father and sister would fight hard and likely say hurtful things. I told her that I had heard criticism my entire life, but this time I would finally have the chance to answer. She laughed warmly and said my grandmother had always known I was stronger than I looked. By that evening she confirmed the petition was filed for May 18 at 10 a.m. on the 42nd floor of Whitford Tower. The next afternoon my father found out about the meeting. I know because Miranda called me, her voice tight and angry, demanding to know what I had done. I acted calm and said I was simply doing my job. Shortly after, my father rushed past my desk without even looking at me, slamming his office door so hard the walls shook. I overheard him dismiss the meeting as pointless and suggest I wasn't capable of being a threat. For the first time in my life, being underestimated felt useful. That night in my small apartment, I carefully prepared. I printed copies of the will, saved the 2018 board minutes to my phone, and wrote a clear statement focused only on facts. Jonathan Ellis confirmed he would attend as the attorney to verify everything, and just before midnight Margaret texted me 2 simple words: petition filed. Margaret's final message the night before read, "See you tomorrow. Your grandmother would be proud." I barely slept, but this time it wasn't fear keeping me awake. It was anticipation. On May 18, 2024 at 9:45 a.m., I stepped off the elevator onto the 42nd floor of Whitford Tower. The space was polished and imposing, with floor-to-ceiling windows and marble floors meant to make visitors feel small. I wore a gray blazer borrowed from one of my roommates, slightly too big, and carried a leather portfolio I had bought secondhand for $12. At the boardroom entrance, a security guard stopped me and said my name wasn't on the authorized list. Before I could respond, Miranda appeared behind me, perfectly dressed in a navy power suit with a silk scarf, every inch the executive. She asked what I was doing there and laughed when I said I had information for the board, reminding me I worked in the copy room. When I calmly answered her question about ROI, her smile faded. Moments later, my father joined us and told me to return to my desk because this didn't concern me. Then Margaret Coleman stepped into the hallway and stated clearly that she had invited me and that I had the right to address the board. After a tense pause, my father stepped aside, clearly unhappy but unable to overrule her authority. Inside, the boardroom was elegant but smaller than I expected, with a long walnut table and portraits of past leaders on the walls, including my grandmother watching from above the fireplace. 12 board members took their seats, with my father at the head and Miranda beside him. I was placed at the far end of the table, but Jonathan Ellis sat quietly nearby with his briefcase, giving me a reassuring nod. The chairman, Robert Hartley, opened the emergency session and confirmed it had been requested by Margaret, Richard Holloway, and Susan Parker. Margaret stood and said the issue involved a document that could impact the company's ownership structure, then turned the floor over to me. Every eye in the room shifted in my direction. Miranda looked amused and my father leaned back as if expecting a mistake. I stood steadier than I felt, thanked the board for their time and opened my portfolio. I told them what I was about to share might surprise them, but I asked that they review the evidence carefully before making any judgment. My father let out a loud sigh, but this time I didn't let it shake me. Before I could say a word, my father raised his hand and started speaking, trying to frame the situation his way. He straightened his jacket slowly and told the board they needed context, using the same calm, condescending tone he always reserved for difficult clients. Margaret spoke up firmly, reminding everyone that I was her daughter, and Gerald's voice tried to paint me as unqualified, claiming I had no legal or financial experience, no strategic expertise, and only an administrative role in the company. Miranda added her own sharp remarks, pointing to my dyslexia and saying some challenges couldn't be overcome no matter the effort. A few board members shifted uneasily, but Robert Hartley, the chairman, cut in. I had the right to speak and the board would hear me. Gerald sat, his face tight, while Miranda mouthed that I was embarrassing myself. But I didn't feel anger. Something colder and sharper took over. They weren't protecting me or the company. They were defending the story where I didn't matter. I calmly pulled the will from my portfolio and announced that this was what I would present. I held up the document. The last will and testament of Ella Laner Margaret Whitford, notarized September 12, 2019. Gerald's face drained of color. He stammered, insisting he had the 2015 will and that we all knew it. I explained without raising my voice that under New York law, a newer valid will cancels all previous versions, and this one was executed 4 years later. I slid it across to Robert Hartley and gestured to Jonathan Ellis, who confirmed he had witnessed the will in 2019. It was notarized, and the original was safely held in escrow. The room stirred as murmurs spread. Miranda tried to call it a forgery, but Jonathan immediately shut that down, warning against accusations without proof. Gerald slammed his hand on the table, claiming my grandmother had been manipulated. I pressed play on a 2018 board meeting recording, letting his own words fill the room as he tried to reduce Eleanor's voting power. Silence fell. Gerald looked defeated, purple-faced and quiet. I calmly reminded the board that Eleanor had every right as a shareholder to record the meeting. Robert Hartley picked up the will, his expression firm, and asked me to read the key passage aloud. I nodded, took a deep breath, and prepared to show the board the truth. Every eye in the room fixed on me, as the moment I had waited for finally arrived. I held the will steady and read aloud. To my granddaughter, Dulce and Whitford, I bequeath 51% of my shares in Whitford Properties LC, along with all associated voting rights. I let the words sink in. This bequest is made with full knowledge of my son Gerald's treatment of Dooley. She has been excluded, diminished, and denied opportunity, not because she lacked ability but because she lacked support. Dooley is not slow. Dooley was abandoned, and I will not allow her father's prejudice to continue after my death. I looked directly at my father. Gerald has confused credentials with character, degrees with worth. He tried to strip me of my voting rights because I saw through him. He marginalized Dulce because she reminded him of the kind of person he refuses to be. Gerald remained silent, his hands trembling. I continued, I built this company from nothing. I choose who carries it forward. I choose Dooley. Robert Hartley removed his glasses. Jonathan, you can confirm this document is legally binding? I can, Jonathan replied. The 2015 will is superseded. As of this moment, Dulce Whitford is the majority shareholder of Whitford Properties. Margaret Coleman smiled quietly. Richard Holloway and Susan Parker exchanged meaningful glances. For the first time I saw my father look at me with something other than dismissal. Fear. Miranda tried to dismiss it. This doesn't prove anything. Even if the will is valid, Dooley has no business experience. She can't run a company. I held up the 2018 board minutes. I'm not asking to run the company yet. I'm asking you to examine the facts. March 14, 2018. Gerald Whitford proposed a resolution to reduce Eleanor Whitford's voting shares from 51% to 10%, claiming she was no longer capable of understanding modern business. That resolution failed by 2 votes, my grandmother's and Margaret Coleman's. Margaret nodded. It is accurate. Eleanor called me that night. She was devastated, not because the resolution failed, but because her own son tried to take everything she built. Gerald tried to dismiss it as ancient history, but I cut him off. This proves my grandmother was of sound mind when she wrote the 2019 will. She was protecting herself and protecting me. Robert Hartley looked around the table. Does anyone have documents contradicting this? Silence. Gerald said nothing. Miranda stared at the table, her composure completely gone. Richard Holloway spoke up. I think we need a recess so legal counsel can review these documents. Hartley agreed. 15 minutes. Jonathan stayed nearby. The board members rose, quietly murmuring to each other. Gerald didn't move, he just stared at his mother's portrait on the wall. The 15-minute recess stretched into 45. Board counsel, a thin man named Patterson, was on the phone the entire time with Morrison and Blake Chase private client, and the New York State Court Records Office. I sat alone at the end of the table, heart steady, while Jonathan Ellis brought me a glass of water, his presence a quiet reassurance as the room buzzed with tension. Margaret Coleman gave my shoulder a reassuring pat as she passed, while Gerald and Miranda huddled in the corner, their whispers rising into heated argument. Finally, Patterson returned and whispered into Robert Hartley's ear. Hartley's expression shifted and he said, surprise then resignation. Please take your seats. The board members returned and the tension in the room was nearly tangible. Our legal counsel has confirmed, Hartley began, that the will presented by Miss Whitford is valid under New York law. It supersedes all previous testamentary documents. Effective immediately, Dulce Whitford holds 51% of Whitford Properties shares. A sharp intake of breath echoed around the table. Hartley continued, as majority shareholder, Miss Whitford has the right to bring motions before the board, including matters related to executive leadership. He looked directly at me. Miss Whitford, do you have any motions to present? I stood, my heart pounding but my voice firm. I have one motion. Gerald rose to interrupt. Robert, sit down, Gerald, Hartley said with surprising authority. Miss Whitford has the floor. Gerald sank back into his chair, gray-faced. I scanned the 12 board members who until an hour ago had never taken me seriously. Now all eyes were on me. The power to decide my father's fate rested in my hands. I thought of my grandmother and made my choice. I am not proposing to remove Gerald Whitford as CEO, I said. Heads snapped up. Miranda, Margaret, even a few board members looked startled. What I am proposing is a vote of confidence. The board will decide whether Gerald Whitford retains your confidence as CEO of Whitford Properties. If the majority votes no confidence, he resigns. If the majority votes confidence, I will not interfere with operational leadership during my tenure as majority shareholder. Miranda scoffed. This is ridiculous. You're turning this into a spectacle, a revenge fantasy. I met her gaze steadily. No. This is corporate governance. The same process that exists in every well-run company, the same process Grandma Eleanor included in our bylaws 40 years ago. If my father retains the board's confidence, he has nothing to worry about. Hartley studied me, something like respect flickering in his expression. Is there a second for this motion? Seconded, Margaret said immediately. Then we'll vote. All those expressing confidence in Gerald Whitford as CEO, raise your hands. 4 hands went up. His allies, those who owed their seats to him. All those expressing no confidence? 7 hands rose. Hartley counted twice, then set down his pen. The motion carries 7-4 with 1 abstention. Mr. Whitford, the board has voted no confidence. Per section 14.3 of our bylaws, you have 30 days to tender your resignation. Gerald didn't respond. He stood, looked at me, and for the first time I expected rage, threats, anything. Instead, I saw something worse. Recognition. He understood he had underestimated me so completely that he had lost everything. Without a word, he walked out. Some of you may be wondering why I didn't just fire him outright. The reason is simple. Revenge isn't justice. Destroying someone doesn't undo what they did to you. It doesn't make right the wrongs that shaped your life. And because my grandmother raised me to be fair, not cruel, that's exactly how I acted. If that hits home for you, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The story isn't finished yet. After the boardroom emptied, Gerald caught me in the private corridor outside, Priscilla at his side. Her mascara was streaked, her face wet with tears. You, Gerald's voice shook with controlled fury, ungrateful, scheming, not here, Priscilla said, putting a hand on his arm, but he pressed on. You just destroyed our family in front of 12 people. I didn't flinch. I didn't destroy anything. I told the truth. The truth. Gerald laughed bitterly. Your grandmother was manipulated. That lawyer, Alice, he must have. Grandma Eleanor wrote that 5 months after you tried to strip her of power because she knew exactly who you are, I said steady. You didn't lose because I betrayed you. You lost because you betrayed her. Priscilla stepped closer. Dulce, you have to understand. We were trying to protect you. You've always struggled. We didn't want to pressure you. I shook my head. You didn't protect me. You erased me. 28 years of silence turned into words. Every Christmas, every family photo, every conversation celebrating Miranda and ignoring me. That wasn't protection. That was abandonment. That wasn't fair. You're right. It wasn't fair, she whispered. I met her eyes. I spent my whole life trying to prove I belonged here. I'm done proving it. The documents speak for themselves. Gerald grabbed my arm. This isn't over. We'll contest the will. I pulled free. You'll lose. You know it. Grandma Eleanor planned for every possibility, including this one. I stepped toward the elevator, ignoring Priscilla calling my name. For the first time in my life, I didn't need their permission. The doors closed and I leaned against the brushed steel wall, finally breathing. The adrenaline faded, leaving grief in its place. Not triumph, not satisfaction. I had ended 28 years of hope that they'd ever see me, love me, or treat me equally. That hope was gone. The elevator descended 42 floors. By the lobby, I had wiped my eyes and straightened my borrowed blazer. Jonathan Ellis waited by security, searching for the right word. Remarkable. Necessary. Your grandmother would approve, he said. He walked beside me as I headed toward the exit. What happens now? I asked. I go home, sleep, and figure out what life looks like without the family I thought I had and without the company tied to them. I never wanted to be CEO. I just want the company Grandma built run by people who care, not by those who see it as an inheritance. Ellis nodded. The board will want to meet with you, discuss transition plans and your role going forward. You're ready for it. I know, but not today. I pushed through the door, feeling the Manhattan sun on my face. Today I didn't need to be a shareholder, a victim, or a symbol. Today I just needed to be Dulce Whitford. I paused, taking a deep breath, and walked away from Whitford Tower, 42 stories of glass and steel bearing my family's name, knowing tomorrow I would start building something new. May 19, 2024, brought the first confirmation. Gerald Whitford had officially resigned. I wasn't present. I learned through an email from Robert Hartley. * Miss Whitford, your father has tendered his resignation effective June 15, 2024. I will serve as interim CEO while we search for permanent leadership. Additionally, the board welcomes you as a strategic advisor, allowing you to participate in key decisions while determining your long-term role. Please advise your thoughts. * I read it 3 times before forwarding it to Jonathan Ellis, who replied within the hour. * Fair offer. No hidden strings. Congratulations, Dulce. * That evening the staff received an official announcement. Gerald Whitford stepping down, Hartley as interim CEO, and Dulce Whitford joining as strategic advisor in her role as majority shareholder. Messages poured in from colleagues who had ignored me for years, suddenly eager to reconnect. Most I ignored, but one from Patricia Morales, an executive assistant who had worked directly with my grandmother since 1987, stopped me cold. * Duly, Eleanor used to talk about you constantly. She said you saw things others missed. I never understood until today. Welcome to the boardroom. She would be proud. Asterisk I saved that message. Some recognition is better coming from those who truly see you. 1 week later the story broke publicly. The New York Business Journal ran it. Whitford Properties shakeup. Founder's granddaughter steps forward after secret will revealed. Corporate privacy laws didn't name me, but everyone in Manhattan real estate knew exactly who it meant. Headlines buzzed about the heir apparent displaced by an unknown family member, and sources close to the board called the transition long overdue, citing long-standing concerns about Gerald's management. Gerald and Priscilla skipped the Metropolitan Museum Gala, citing health reasons. Investment partners requested private meetings with me instead of the board or my father. One after another they affirmed their continued support. We've had concerns about Gerald's leadership for years. Your grandmother built something special. It's good to see her vision protected. The social fallout was immediate. Invitations faded, old alliances shifted, and the Whitford name, once a key to every Upper East Side door, now carried a quiet asterisk, but I didn't mind. I had finally claimed my place, not as a shadow in my family's story, but as someone who could carry forward what truly mattered. That I didn't feel triumph, and I didn't feel satisfaction either. Margaret Coleman called me that Saturday morning. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice warm. I admitted, "I don't know yet. Ask me in 6 months." She chuckled softly. "Fair enough. Eleanor would have handled it the same way, giving him a chance instead of taking everything away. She always said mercy is the real power move." I thought about that long after we hung up. Mercy isn't weakness, it's a choice. And for the first time that choice was mine. A few weeks later, June 8, 2024, my phone rang at 2 p.m. My mother's voice was quiet, fragile. "Dulce, can we meet? Just us." I agreed and met her at a midtown coffee shop. Priscilla was there too. She looked older, tired, the careful makeup failing to hide the stress in her eyes. She held her cup like it was a lifeline. "Thank you for coming. I know I don't deserve it," she said. I asked her directly, "What do you want, Mom?" She looked down and whispered, "To apologize. For everything, the way we treated you, the words we said, the things we left unsaid." I pressed gently, "Are you apologizing because you're truly sorry or because everything changed?" She admitted, "Both. I lied to myself, told myself we were protecting you from pressure, but really I was protecting myself. I let your father call you worthless in front of everyone. I never defended you. I know that. I can't undo it, but I don't want to lose you completely. I had to try. I studied the woman who'd been my mother for 28 years. The one who braided my hair as a child but ignored me as an adult. I can't erase the past 20 years, I said slowly, but I'm willing to start building something honest." She nodded, speechless. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. 2 months later, August 2024, Miranda called while I walked through Central Park. "Dulce, can we meet? I need to say something." I almost didn't answer, but I went. We sat on a bench near Bethesda Fountain in the August heat. He looked different, vulnerable. Her usual perfection was gone, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back carelessly. "I've been in therapy," she said plainly, 3 times a week since May. I said, "That's good." She laughed weakly. "Brutal. Turns out being the golden child isn't a gift. It's a cage. Everything I did, every achievement, it was never enough. And I thought I was protecting you by not speaking up, but I was only protecting myself. If I defended you, I'd become a target too." She met my eyes. "That's not an excuse. Just the truth." I asked softly, "What do you want from me, Miranda?" She shook her head. "Nothing. I don't deserve anything. I just wanted you to know that I see you now. I really see you. I'm sorry it took so long." We sat in silence, letting the words settle, realizing some bridges could be rebuilt, slowly and carefully, even if trust would take time. 2 sisters who had grown up in the same house but felt like strangers. "I can't go back to how things were," I said finally, "but I don't want to stay enemies either. Maybe we can start over." Miranda's eyes glistened with tears. "I'd like that. It wasn't the sisterhood I hoped for as a child, but maybe now it can be real." By November 2024, 6 months after the board meeting, I had moved into my own apartment in Brooklyn Heights. 1-bedroom, pre-war building with a view of the bridge my grandmother had crossed to her first office in 1965. The rent was high, but I could afford it now with my new role as Director of Sustainable Development at Whitford Properties, earning $185,000 a year, plus dividends from my shares. The division was my idea, focusing on green buildings, sustainable practices, and environmental impact. Projects my grandmother would have supported if she'd lived to see them. Gerald called once a month, brief, polite, pretending the past hadn't happened. Priscilla and I met for lunch every other week, slowly building a real connection. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Miranda and I started having coffee on weekends, learning each other for the first time. We acknowledged the past without pretending it was okay, but we were writing a new chapter. On my apartment wall hung my grandmother's portrait, the same one that had overseen the boardroom for decades. Sometimes when the light hit just right, it felt like she was smiling at me. "You did it, Grandma. You gave me the tools. I just had to be brave enough to use them. 6 months ago I was invisible. Now I was fully myself." Looking back, I understand why my grandmother left me 51% of her company. Not because I was better than Miranda, but because she knew I wouldn't let power corrupt me like it had my father. Dyslexia isn't a flaw. It's part of who I am. My visual memory, patience, and ability to see patterns others miss. The qualities that once made me slow were the same ones that let me see the truth when everyone else turned away. Gerald measured worth by credentials. Eleanor measured it by character and how people treated those who couldn't fight back. And now I finally measure my own worth. Not by my family, not by my sister, not by strangers, but by my own standard, my own truth. If you see yourself in my story, if you've ever been overlooked or dismissed, know this. You don't need a secret inheritance to prove your value. But you do need permission to stop seeking approval from those who will never give it. Boundaries aren't walls. They're doors that let you choose who enters your life and on what terms. My family hurt me for 28 years, but I didn't need to hurt them back. I just needed to stop waiting for them to see me and start seeing myself. That is the true inheritance my grandmother left me. And nobody can ever take it away. If this story resonates, if it reminds you that your worth is yours alone, I want to hear from you. Subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment sharing your story. For more stories about ordinary people finding the courage to stand up for themselves, check the link in the description. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Until next time.